Good afternoon. My name is Pierre Poilievre. I'm running. He's a careless bugger. He left his notes here from yesterday. Listen, you got to start where you got to start, I suppose. Thank you very much for inviting me here. I don't get out very much, and rarely by invitation. And the fact that you've done it twice almost puzzles me. I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Johnson's celebrated remark on second marriages. He made that about 200 years ago, before divorce became mandatory, as it is today. But he said that the second marriage was a triumph of hope over experience. This is what you guys have done here. You've brought me back. I should say a number of things before I have to express my fact. I like coming out here. It's as simple as that. But I have secondary motivations as well. It's understandable that according to Newton's laws that two bodies, however wretched, cannot occupy the same space at the same time. Well, because I'm here, it means I'm not in Toronto. And you may be familiar with well, I'm sure you are, that every point of latitude that you come west from Toronto, your IQ increases exponentially. When I was in Toronto Airport recently, which by the way is no longer an airport, it's Justin Trudeau's private disease center control. If you don't go in there dressed like a doctor about to do an operation, you can't get on the planes. Well, as I said, it's a nice thing, but having escaped Toronto, when I left, I could barely tie my own shoes. I had to hire someone to give me a hand. And when I got off the plane in Regina, I was solving quadratic equations in my head, and I plugged a few holes in Einstein's general theory of relativity. It was kind of the introducer to indicate that I am no longer with the CBC. I miss my many functions there. It used to be, for example, one of my main duties at about 9 o'clock at night. I used to go down to the lobby where it was my task to water the ferns and refresh the incense that we had there in front of the tofu statue of Bishop Suzuki. You cannot imagine how much I miss doing that. And even though I've been out of it for about 3 or 4 years, my mind is not yet fully recovered. So if I stumble a lot during this, blame it on my past. Oh, by the way, I was really sorry. It was no choice of mine, but last night I know that you had the quite celebrated Mr. Quick Dick McDick. Have I got that right? Mr. Quick Dick McDick. He's a very bold man. I mean, I would never dare use a stage name like that. My appendage is not quick. Never was, if you want to know the truth. Oh my, what am I doing? I was out last night briefly, and I saw one of the great Western trains. I mean, by the way, in Newfoundland, we have no trains. We have no tracks. We have no sense. But that's not the point. The train just went on and on and on. It was longer than the list of Jagmeet Singh's excuses for joining the Liberals. Did you know that Jagmeet has joined the trans movement? He's transitioned to the Liberal Party. And he's undergoing principal therapy, restoration. He has to find some reasons, and as I said, the list of them is ever more surprising. The last time I was here, I told a story, but it's the kind of story that I can only tell in Saskatchewan. So those of you who were here the last time, you're getting a rerun. CBC is still part of my consciousness. You can see that. It was a story that I had done a film in about 95, I think it was, about the Newfoundland fishery. And I'm not going to expand it as I did the last time. But so many people back home really got ripped. There were 30,000 inshore fishermen that lost their jobs. And I'm going to make the story short. So I did this 20-minute documentary on the National. I was still in Newfoundland. And the letters, because this was before the internet and email and Twitter, when people still knew how to write. So they wrote letters. And to write a letter to say something about a television show takes a bit of effort. And without boasting, and it isn't a boast, there were thousands of them that came into the CBC Toronto. And I assumed that obviously they came from either the East Coast and mainly from Newfoundland, because this is what the story was about, right? All these poor people cut off from a fishery that lasted 500 years. Well, when I got to Toronto and they let me go in to look at the mailbags, I found that most of them were from out west. And they were from farmers out west, mainly farmers. And so I kept that in mind, and I thought, this is really interesting. Anyway, here's where it relates to Saskatchewan. I was doing another story on the family farms about the same period. And I went to Redvers, because we found a family there that had the grandfather, the father, and the son. So it was a nice combination. And while we were waiting to do the film, I asked the grandfather in particular, I said, this has really surprised me. You know, we're all the way from Newfoundland, and you guys are way out here, and I do a story on fish, and most of the bail came from west. In fact, by the way, some of you sent money. You see this vest? Yeah, you did. But the farmer explained to me, he said, what's wrong with you? He said, back in the dirty 30s, you know, the days of real collapse and the Depression and the Dust Bowl, and he said, you guys weren't even in Confederation. And we didn't have any government, not that it's any better now. But the small towns, I mean, and the outports, somehow or other, I never figured out this. They got together and they collected salt fish, they put it in barrels, and somehow they got it sent all the way over to the farmers of the prairies. And he said, we don't forget out here, you know, when someone does a kindness to us, it stays in the memory. And I thought, you know, this is really a beautiful story that roughly 60 years later, an almost ancestral memory motivates the farmers of the West in modern times to send so much sympathy and goodwill towards fishermen in the East. And I think that's one of the great understories of Confederation, that the things that bind us together and the things that make us concerned for each other, they come from basically the organic level of society. They don't come from the Department of Middle Class Prosperity, which has to be the biggest joke that we have ever had in this country. No, they come from ordinary citizens who have that natural sympathy for the fate of their fellow citizens. So it's a great story of the real meaning of Confederation. And I just like telling that again to the people who were so kindly receptive to the disasters that happened to us on the East Coast, you know, now about 30 years ago. And there's a follow-up to it. I liked it so much, and I really do, that I was out again, and this time it was at a college, obviously just young people. And so I told the story again, and there were 3 or 4 fairly vigorous young women in the front row, and when I finished, one of them just jumped up, and she said, I know about that. And I was staggered. You know, young people, they're not supposed to know history. Oh, yes, she said. I know all about that. She said, my grandfather got 3 barrels of the stuff. Oh, I said, this is really good. And, you know, what did he do? Well, she said, he didn't know what it was. He didn't know what to do with it. I said, he didn't know what to do with the salt fish? No, she said. I asked her, well, what did he do? Well, she said, he buried it. I said, do you know where he buried it? Yeah, she said, yeah, I suppose I do. Well, I said, it's still good. So there are links. Also, before I get too serious about anything, I want to say thanks because he is a gem of hospitality. I don't know how he treats you. He's probably a tyrant out here. But Dan Cognate has been extremely good to me. He even drove me in from Regina Airport in his pickup. And I fortunately had the Sierra Club calculator for damages done to earth life by people driving a pickup. And I calculated, according to the Sierra reading, that drive from Regina to here, effectively, we killed 6 penguins, 2 otters, and Elizabeth May's cat. You know, eventually I'm going to get to a point, but let me know when it happens, will you? One of the things I'd like to underscore as well before I get into any genuine talk about specifically the oil and gas industry is that this country is in so many ways in such a mess. I'm not making a political speech, and I'm really not partisan, despite what people say, and I don't care what they say. This country is having some really strange moments. Of all the strange moments, and we've had so very, very many of them, this whole business of the truckers' protest. You know, you all know, you know it better than me because you're the object of a lot of the protests. Most protests now are theatrical. They're not driven by some fundamental impulse that comes out of a person who starts reading newspapers or talking to neighbors and sees something. This is wrong, and I've got to challenge it. Most of it now is professional. They have more PR consultants at Greenpeace than they have botanists. And they're mainly fundraising, and they're political agencies as much as any political party. So a real protest, by which I mean, I'll use that awful word, organic. An organic protest is something that emerges among normal citizens who normally do not have time to waste their time gluing themselves to gates or throwing cakes at the Mona Lisa. They just see something, they're trying to get their lives on, they're trying to do their work, but something happens and they say, look, this is not right, and we've got to let our governments know about it. The reason I'm detailing that is that the truckers' protest, I don't care if you agreed with the goals, but it was organic. The people who were being praised at the beginning of the great COVID regime hailed, you know, the truckers are feeding us. At the end of it, according to our eminent prime minister, if I can remember most of it, they were misogynists, they were homophobes, they were racists, and they were intolerable. Oh yes, and they were yobs. My fellow yobs, my fellow insurrectionists, my fellow intolerables. This is disgusting. And then we bring in the Emergencies Act, which is in any other time is meant for a genuine emergency. There was not a single capital city in the entire country, and that includes Ottawa, that had the slightest whiff of any sense of menace from this protest. It was civil. It was demure. It was, if you saw some of the film, it was actually happy. And that we should bring down the legislation that suspends utterly the entire civil liberties of the country for 7 days and then doesn't even let it go through to the Senate. It never really got ratified. And I read, this is why I'm going on this rant, I read yesterday in the newspaper that it will be at least 7 months before it is possible to conduct an inquiry into whether the Emergency Act was justified in the first place. Let me tell you something. At most, it took 2 days around that cabinet table to decide to bring it in. So during that 2 days, they had 1, 2, or 3 reasons, or pretend reasons, why they thought they could justify it. Why does it take 7 months to tell the general public whose civil liberties were interrupted so savagely? Why does it take 7 months to give the 3 reasons that they figured out in 2 days? The depth of arrogance is amazing. It really is amazing. We've gone through COVID. We've relaxed our own vigilance. The political class is completely disunited from the ordinary public. This is the reason why out here, and I've been going back and forth to the West for a long time, out here, you're peripheral. You're second tier. I don't say that with glee. I actually like the Confederation. I actually like Canada. And the reason that I seem to have, and I don't think I'm faking it, the reason I seem to have such a kind of half bond with the West is because I got such a full bond with the East. That the eastern provinces and the western provinces, they, united in their spirit and in their manner, provide the impulses that keep civility and the civil nature of this country together. It's the Peter Lougheed syndrome. Lougheed was probably the most patriotic Albertan that ever lived. But his patriotism for Alberta at the time fired an even greater patriotism for the generality, for the community of Canada. That kind of political mind is no longer present. The crowd that are in Ottawa today, and this is not partisan, it's based on what they do. They are so far disconnected from the ordinary lives of ordinary people. And this is why, by the way, I find this really, really amusing. You know, when John A. Macdonald was around here, John A. had a great national goal. He would build a Trans-Canada Railway, and that would bring us together. We've seen other nations pose other great projects that united the intelligence and the spirit of the citizens. You saw it after the Second World War, the Grand Marshall Plan that renovated Europe, kept some of it from communism, and brought the world back to some sort of harmony. What's the great goal that is presently in front of all Canadians? And what is the sterling slogan that will summon us from our beds and our fireplaces and rush into the streets with the cry of exultation? We have a great national goal. What is it? Well, it's brilliant as a word formula. It's net zero. When will a country marshal its energies behind net zero? The slogan itself is meaningless. They don't believe the end goal themselves. And I'll tell you something else. Climate change. You see the journalists, all of them asking, do we have a climate change plan? You can't have a climate change plan. The climate is going to do what it wants to do, whether Justin Trudeau puts a carbon tax on you or not. It is one of the most risible things in the world, and it is why, now I will get to a point, it is why you guys, and I'm using that generically, I haven't got my 52 gender pronouns written out yet. It is why you guys, in an inexplicable manner, have for the last 15 to 20 years, by which I mean oil and gas. It is why the oil and gas industry in this country has been for 15 years, the declared or undeclared, tacit or explicit, you have been declared a menace to the world. You have been declared world destroyers. You have been made villains. To support the oil and gas industry, as I have learned, is a wonderful way to harvest all sorts of extreme abuse. Do you know the one word that should characterize, the enmity against against Canada's greatest industry? Farming could challenge it. Greatest industry. The one word that would characterize a campaign against it? It's ingratitude. Do you know something? You do know it. Half the countries of this world would weep to have even a third of the essential resources of energy in this world. Either God, or if you are not religious, providence, fate, or chance, it doesn't matter which, bestowed upon this vast country. It is vast. Such a plenitude of the most essential element in the functioning of every modern civilization. You cannot go to anything. Everything that counts, everything that makes our life secure, everything that gives extra enjoyment, everything that allows us to search knowledge as others have never been able to do so before. We are living in a time of miracles. You honored, and by the way, it was very good to see, you honored your legends here yesterday, and they talked of 1950. I can think of 1950 as well. I'm an old bastard. And I know what it was like in Newfoundland. And if my grandfather were alive today, and he could see the level that society has grown, the prosperity that has, compared to then, that has been extended, the resources of technology and science and communication that were not even a dream. Anybody from that period who could be hauled quickly to this present would stagger in shock that so much has been advanced, and that when your grandfathers were out, marshalling by hand, when the pioneers came to this country and wrestled with storms and cold and lack of any kind of provision of health or education, we have it so good. And the main reason we have it so good is that we have resources that God or providence laid down. And in this country of Canada, we have this one resource, oil and gas and its derivatives, upon which all of modern civilization depends, upon which the security of nations depend. And we have a cluster of politicians and eco-lunatics who keep telling you that this stuff is the material of Armageddon. The ingratitude that nature has thrown this in a country of only 35, 37 million people on a landmass that is almost unexampled in the whole wide world. And we have these dancers in Ottawa saying, well, we can't close down the oil and gas industry tomorrow. They weren't saying that in a tone of, oh my God, isn't that wonderful? That was a tone of sorrow. This is insane. I mean, that is the word for it. And the idea that these preening, I won't say that word, these preening people dance across to Davos and Paris and Rio de Janeiro and Beijing. They never go to Red Deer, they never go to Fort McMurray to hold a climate conference. They haven't met one of you. They know nothing of what you do. And they are careless in the extremity to allow it, to go unexploited, but to demonize it and to demonize the people that work in it. I can't be alone in thinking this transcends all reason. It goes beyond being irresponsible. Just think again of those terrible third world countries, as we call them. Imagine if they had this resource at their command. Would they be putting an embargo on pipelines? There's another thing that really, really, really astonishes me. That pipelines I mean, they're going to end the world. You have a whole province basically being strangulated by a federal policy of its own government. How does this happen? And that's where I'll give Poilievre some credit. I'm not endorsing him because I'll kill him. But I will endorse the idea that at least someone is starting to say that the oil and gas industry in this country is fundamental to almost all of our necessities. The rise in technology and farming, the transportation networks, the hospitals, the schools. Science itself depends on energy. Without minerals and without oil and gas and energy, there is nothing. And the idea that you're going to build solar panels in Newfoundland, have you been there? You have to bring a picture of the sun to Newfoundland. And let me tell you, as far as climate change is concerned, we know all about it. We haven't had 2 days of consecutive same weather since 1497. I mean, really. And as far as climate change, well, I'll throw one more at you. I'm for it. If I could get another 3 or 4 degrees out in St. Mary's Bay tomorrow morning, I'd be a happy man. I mean, this thing is, it's so depressing. It really is. You know, we have a great country. We really do. Even in the mess that it's in. And even with these amateur, anti-intellectual dilettantes that are currently running it. The ordinary people, or the working people, or the people with industry, and the people who are not checking in on the Johnny Depp trial. These people keep the country alive. They keep it functioning. They keep the balance of sanity that is obviously absent from our public life. Oil and gas, along with farming, along with along with the truckers, along with the supermarket clerks. These are the people you should celebrate. You could have the collapse of the oil industry out here or in Alberta tomorrow morning, and it might get 2 minutes on CBC. If they could be, I don't know, logical for 2 minutes, which is probably a strain in that particular organization. But if you have 3 people gluing themselves to a glass case down in Toronto and saying they're stopping world hunger, that'll get an hour special. Our news media are part of this particular problem. They have ceased being media, which means in the middle, and they have become activists. They have become participants in the stories that they are reporting. And that's not some, bitter, declining, deliquescent old fool up here. That's simply the case. They can't be relied upon anymore because they think they're part of the game. I'll go back to a point. This is a huge conference. It's a huge conference on a central industry. But I'll tell you what, you won't get the same amount of attention on CTV Global or CBC if someone changes a pronoun in Ottawa. I mean, we're upside down, we're outside in. Logic is fled. But let me go back to the main thing. We do have such a great country. And the people that made it are the people you honored yesterday and a generation or 2 generations back from them. There was a lot of toil, a lot of actual work. There was a lot of hardship and extremity. There was a lot of anxiety. There was exposure. There was so much work put into providing the heritage that we are gathering today. The relative ease with which we conduct our daily lives. The security. We don't worry about the next storm in the way that people back then had to worry about it. We have, back in Newfoundland in the 30s and 40s, there was no such thing as a hospital except in St. John's. You had polio, you had diphtheria, you had all the childhood illnesses, you had infant mortality. Skip forward 50, 60 years. We have built through the generations that gave it to us, through their labor, through their industry, through their invention, to their ambition for their sons and daughters. They built a wonderful, temperate country. We saw it in 9/11 when the Americans landed all those planes in Gander. 37 planes from all over the world, some of the richest people in the world, ending up in a small town. Well, they thought it was small. Gander is actually our Paris. But they ended up in those places, and they went to Gambo. Gambo has all of 500 people and was run by the Salvation Army woman who took these poor Americans out of the bus, and they couldn't understand a word she was saying. And they ordered the women to go into the Salvation Army temple, which was made of concrete, and they ordered the men to go into the Science Museum and school, which was basically an empty room with a picture of a Microsoft computer on the wall. I'm going back there just to show you that it was not a government organized thing. It was once again the people. That's the nature of Canada. It would be the same if it happened out here. That the generality of citizens have correct impulses. They have wells of charity and good feeling. They do love their country, though it is being severely tested out here that the arrangement that was made in 1867 seems to have been warped. And if a federal government can basically declare the economy of a single province to be off limits or wrong, that needs to be fixed. And it isn't good enough to say, no. So we have this wonderful place, and yet there are divisions being stirred up. They are. We're exciting rancor between classes. Urban and rural are not in communication. The so-called professional bureaucracy and political apparatus of Ottawa, Montreal, and Toronto is not responsive and is ignorant of the nature and texture of daily life outside of their special zone. The strong point in this is that there are people like you. There are people like the people you honored yesterday. There are people, in other words, who have not cut themselves loose from reality, who have not been blinded by these fetish ideologies, and who will not give in to the rabid and obsessive and false green ideologies that they pretend to like the earth. My feeling is they dislike the people on it, and that is their stronger motivation. To you people out here, as I said at the very beginning, you're remarkable for your hospitality, your ease of welcome. You're also remarkable for the tremendous patience that you seem to have exhibited for 10 to 15 years over the malignant and stupid hostility towards a very central industry. Now, I know I started off by telling you about Redvers, and I've said that before. I said it 3 years ago. And being old and declining and a poor old mind, not really anchored in anything, I'm now going to repeat myself again, but I won't know I'm repeating myself. Only you will know. Okay? Is that okay? Okay. I'm so glad to be here. I have no way of ending anything, so I have a story that I've probably told 1,800 times, and half of you have already heard it, and I don't care. I'm going to tell it again anyway. It's a story, it's true, which doesn't make it any better, but it is true. In 1997, which is 500 years after Cabot stumbled into Bonavista on his way to China. I mean, this was a navigational error of some considerable magnitude. And he thought he'd found it. I mean, even in 1997, but in 1497 to mistake Beijing for Bonavista. I mean, it wasn't till, 5 years ago that Bonavista even had a Chinese restaurant. It's true. Anyway, we invited the Queen to come over because we were the oldest colony. I'll make this quick because I know you have lives. She did. She really did. She came over and we took her to Bonavista. And it was terrible. It was really, really terrible. You had rain and snow and sleet and hail and fog and wind. It was June the 24th. The result being you couldn't see her. We had half the cameras in the world. This was a royal visit. I was there myself, but the cameras couldn't find her. She wasn't there. So we're a quick people, and we're not, Dick McQuick, but we're quick. We took her back to St. John's, and we said, you're going to go indoors this time because we can't depend on the weather. Climate change. So they brought her into the biscuit factory we have. There's a very famous biscuit factory. It's like Tim Hortons generally. Purity Biscuits Newfoundland is stamped on the mental fabric of every Newfoundlander. Purity Biscuits. That's all they make is biscuits. So she's in there, and they got a stage like this, and in front of it there's 3 great big steel vats, and they're filled with 2,000 pounds of biscuit dough, and a great blender stirring them electronically, being controlled by a man on the platform pressing a button. He's wearing a long white coat. He's probably going off to Pearson Airport later in the day. So he's pressing the button. The blenders are spinning 6,000 pounds of biscuit dough, and Her Majesty walks across to him, and I cannot do her accent. But she looks up, she says, and now remember where she is, the Purity Biscuit Factory. And she looks up, she says, and what are you making, sir? And there is a pause as long as the Reformation. And finally, he looks down at her, he says, $12.50 an hour, ma'am. Number 1601. Let me wrap it up. It could all have been said in 2 minutes and spared you this agony, but it really is very simple. You're in a cardinal industry. You do it as well as any bunch of people in the world. Okay? Secondly, the resource you extend to the world is the most necessary resource. Without energy, no thing is. Stasis or stillness is the absence of energy. So it is cardinal, it is essential, and you do it scrupulously. And in an inversion of values, the people who are trying to stop you have made the energy you can't export by pipeline a weapon for a dictator. The more they strangulate industry in the proper places, the more they weaponize and arm and give force to the negative elements of our world. And third, unless there is some recalibration of the nature of our modern day confederation that disallows the central authority, which has very little acquaintance with some of its own provinces, to bring out national and international policies that suffocate provincial economies, we're in for a very stressful time. Now, Dan Cognett has made 2 mistakes, the first invitation and the second. I absolutely assure you he will not make a third. Thanks very much.